Despite our fascination with the polarized politics south of the border, not many here twigged to the stunning upset that delivered America's current president. The divisions in our politics largely pale by comparison to those in the U.S., but that doesn't mean we're immune. Joining us now to consider if there is cause for concern that such fractured politics could be headed for Canada, we welcome Frank Graves. He's president of Ecos Research Associates. Christopher Cochrane, associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto and the author of Left and Right, The Small World of Political Ideas. Christine Brophy, doctoral student in psychology at the University of Toronto. And, of course, we welcome back Ken White, first ever editor, incidentally, first ever editor-in-chief of the National Post, now author of Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. We are delighted to welcome you two for the first time here on this set, you only for the second time, and you were here about 2 minutes ago. So nice to see you again, too. Frank, let's go through some of these numbers here. This is sort of an aggregation of recent polls. CBC, I think, published this. Early December, Liberals 39, Conservatives 32, NDP 16, Greens at 7, that's the federal scene. Nothing particularly surprising about those numbers. Yet your recent studies suggest that below the surface there is something brewing in Canadian politics today. What's brewing?
Well, I'm not crazy about the label populism, but it's one that's been used to apply to a number of the kinds of movements that we're talking about. And what we think is going on, and we see it in Canada as well, is that for many people, this protracted period of economic stagnation and a sense of falling behind has produced a different outlook on what kind of political solutions might be available that they would find compelling. And it's really had a transformative effect, obviously much more so in the case of things like Brexit and Donald Trump. But I think even in Canada, and by the way, just to give you an update of data that is completed as of yesterday in a poll that will be coming out with Canadian Press, we have the Conservatives actually leading by 5 points right now. So they're, and if we look at where, for example, the Liberals seem to have had some problems, it's precisely with this group which is being attracted to more of a populist message.
When we think about political alternatives, heretofore it's been left versus right. I gather you have a new filter which says open versus ordered. What does that mean?
Well, actually, I've kind of pinched it from 60 years ago from Daniel Bell, who said that the left-right ideological wars would be replaced by this ordered open spectrum. And although there's clear lineage connecting them, the debates are not so much about the same kinds of traditional conservative and progressive issues as they are about what kind of a society we want. In terms of this filter, do we want to be relatively more open or relatively more ordered, which is also in many respects closed, which is kind of goes to the notion of let's kind of restore some period where of nostalgically imagined as a more secure, less divisive country that would be, make me feel more comfortable. I mean, some of the numbers we see are frankly startling. The fact that only 13% of Canadians, and the number's the same in the United States, actually 10%, think their kids are going to do better than them. Well, that used to be the whole idea.
Right.
The middle class bargain was you work hard, you maybe come up with a better mousetrap, you're going to get a house, you're going to get a secure job, you're going to do better than your parents, you're going to retire in relative comfort, and your kids will do better than you. And that worked for the last half of the 20th century
that
pretty well.
That social contract seems to be in trouble today.
Well, it's not in trouble, it's in shambles. People who have felt that, for example, they used to be in the middle class, but now they've fallen into the working class. And just to give you some context on that, we've got the incidence of people who would find themselves as self-defined members of the middle class in both Canada and the United States was around 70%. As the century opened up, it's dropped to the mid-40s.
We got all these numbers here.
Okay,
why don't we bring these up now? These are your numbers. Sheldon, you want to go for these here? Asked about their personal financial situation over the last 5 years, 37% say they have fallen behind, about the same say staying the same, 22%, a smaller number, moving ahead. Are you better off than your parents were? About a third say worse off, less than a third, about the same, a third better off. Will your children be better off? Look at this, 56% say they think their kids will be worse off than they. Almost 3 in 10, about the same. Only 13% think their kids are going to do better than they will. And just to emphasize again what Frank just said, asked to describe yourself, what class are you in? Only 13% describe themselves as poor, 37% working class, 43%. You wonder why politics is all about going after the middle class? Because 43% of us think we're middle class, and only 4% think that we are upper class.
If I can give you some harder measures, we asked people, not just are you think you're doing worse than your parents, we ask, okay, compared to we use father, we also use parents, your father at this stage in life in today's dollars, are you making more or less? Okay, and people can answer that question. They don't know the exact numbers, but they know roughly whether they're making more or less. And this is a measure of intergenerational mobility. For seniors, only 15% say that they're doing worse than their father. For boomers, the number goes up to about 30. As we get down into millennials, it's well over 50%. So the rates of downward intergenerational mobility have trebled on one watch. So, you know, yeah, I mean, this is, by the way, all the places, and Pew measures this internationally, places who think their kids are going to do better off are doing better off. If you have this crippling sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that everything's going to be worse, it isn't sort of healthy for the future.
Christopher, let me get you to weigh in on this notion of open versus ordered as opposed to left versus right. Your take.
Well, I think the left and right as labels are moving targets. It's one of those things that everybody knows it when they see it, but they have a very hard time telling you exactly what it is. And there's certainly elements of authoritarian sort of dispositions and orderliness on the left, both presently and historically. But presently, those elements seem to be disproportionately represented on the right. And a lot of the sort of populist authoritarian sentiment, for example, that's behind support for Donald Trump. Not entirely behind support for Donald Trump, but nonetheless there. The challenge for the Conservatives in Canada has been, and you see this in the leadership race that the Conservatives have just had, you see this also for Patrick Brown in Ontario. The challenge is at the elite level to try to keep a lid on that, because it's unclear that this will be popular with the rest of the province, or the rest of the country. And we'll see whether they're able to do it. I mean, Canadians are not immune to ideational currents occurring in other places. Right now, there is a very strong and unique ideational current emanating from the United States, which is overwhelmingly the largest cultural influence.
Ideational current means?
Yeah, it's just the sets of ideas that political elites are advocating. I mean, people don't altogether make up their own minds on each issue. They often look to political elites, or they look to opinion leaders or people they respect to try to find, what their opinion on different issues ought to be. And right now, there are a lot of Canadians looking south to the United States, not overwhelming that, too many, but certainly a lot of conservatives, or more conservatives than others, looking to the United States to see what should their positions be on things like immigration, on things like Islam, and you see this discussed a lot, on things like attitudes towards elites. So as these issues intensify in the U.S., they're likely to have an influence here as well.
Christine, could you talk to us about the kind of research you do and whether it helps us understand, if a conservative is a conservative is a conservative and a liberal is a liberal is a liberal? Help us with that.
So a lot of the work that I do is looking at the underlying kind of biological mechanisms or personality factors, these fundamentally common sort of temperaments or traits that everybody has, and how they pattern or cluster together to predict what types of policies individuals are going to support. For example, on the liberal side, it is true that we have this trait that's called openness for personality, and it's linked to things like creativity, imagination, reordering of sort of aesthetic type qualities, whereas on the conservative side, we see something that's like conscientiousness, and that's where the orderliness sort of comes in. And when you look at the surface sort of labels for orderliness, you see that they like to have rules, that they're very efficient, they always get things done on time. So that's where this kind of idea of people, when they're looking at it, they think, oh, well, conservatives, they're looking for something that's stable and closed system they can control. Whereas on the liberal side of things, liberalism is built on top of this already stable society where we have these rules and regulations that have created individuals who, by habitual behavior, are acting morally. So because of that, liberals walk in with this preconceived notion that we're a blank slate and we're inherently benevolent. So from there, then they're just able to work day by day to reorganize things to achieve the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people.
Frank, let's follow up with some numbers that you have tested Canadians on as it relates to immigration. And here's the question. How receptive are Canadians to levels of immigration by visible ethnic minorities? And there's a graph that your organization has put together. In 1994, let's just sort of pluck a couple of years off here, 40% felt that there were too many visible ethnic minorities. In 2005, the number is down to 18%. But in 2017, there we are up again. We're up around 37% right now. Tell us the story behind this chart.
Well, because people can legitimately say I'm not comfortable with immigration because of the job competition or pressure on social programs, we came up with this version that said, well, let's forget about the levels and let's just talk about of those who are coming, are too many, too few, or about the right numbers of visible minorities, which when I randomly experiment and change white produces exactly the same results. And so we saw this period where there was a pretty clear decline in the opposition, which was very heated in the middle of the 90s. In fact, the debate about immigration in Canada was much more intense and passionate and polarized at that time than it was as we closed out the century, where everyone said, yeah, it's sort of a good idea. We like globalization. But as this century's unfolded, and I believe it's linked to this sense of economic despair that many feel, there's been a rise in questioning a lot of the ingredients of the bargain that elites have put together and said would be good for you. And many people say it isn't good for me. So immigration would be one of those, globalization, trade liberalization, all of these things which were seen as, you know, preconditions for success have been found flawed by many people who say, it didn't work for me. You seem to be doing all right, which is why we get a lot of this elite resentment, which, you know, this version of populism is expressing. And I found the comments about personality fascinating and links up well, I think, with the fact that, yeah, some of these things are east is east and west is west, and they're predetermined cognitively by predispositions. Liberals tend to look for look for reason and evidence. Conservatives are attracted to moral certainty. But in this era, and what I think happens is the theory is that these personality types can become engaged under certain circumstances and express themselves differently. So that's why I think things are changing, and what the two critical conditions for this more ordered personality expression are a sense of economic despair and a magnified sense of external threat. These theories came out of the work of Adorno and Brunswick and Hannah Arendt and that bunch back in trying to understand what went on in Germany. But, you know, the same kinds of updated measures. Do you think when you're raising your child that you should emphasize creativity or obedience? You know, more than half Canadians say it should be obedience. Well, that's an authoritarian trait.
Well, I'm always, Ken, interested in those who say Donald Trump is an unprecedented populist, conservative political force when, I don't know, maybe I'm out in left field here, I guess it'd be right field in this case, but I thought we had him first in Rob Ford. I thought the conservative populist mayor of Toronto, you know, beat the U.S. by a little bit. Do you see it that way?
I would go further. I think we had him first in Stephen Harper. Not that, you know, two remarkably different people, and Harper had a sense of responsibility and dignity that Trump utterly lacks. But Harper was a small c conservative. He talked a lot about security issues, about immigration. He was a Tim Hortons sort of leader.
As opposed to Starbucks.
That's right, yes. And so I think we had that sort of small c populism here in Canada. We were early adopters, and we're seeing it now in the States with an utterly different kind of leader. But many of the same issues that motivated conservatives here to support Harper are motivating people to support Trump in the U.S.
If there is this rising sense of whatever you want to call it, closed or populist or whatever the word we're looking for here is, I find it very interesting that Patrick Brown, you just referenced him a moment ago, the current opposition leader in Ontario, has decided to go 180 degrees away from that and put forward a platform that is very progressive conservative. I think I've seen a lot of commentators say, took a chapter right out of Bill Davis's playbook from 45 years ago. Is that not an unusual thing to do if a larger chunk of us are going in the opposite direction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the Conservatives have learned in Ontario for the past couple of elections that their goal here is not to lose it. It's to be a viable alternative to an unpopular Liberal government and hope that people will feel comfortable parking their vote. That's different than the Mike Harris approach, which was we need to go out with a very clear message and try to win this election. So they had a coherent, clear platform on a number of different items.
Designed to appeal to a much narrower base of the population as well.
Precisely. And, you know, one of the things that is a bit peculiar about left-right positioning and how people feel, is that it's often the case that people who are slightly right, for example, will look more favorably. I mean, to the extent that we can speak in terms of degree and not kind, which is, I think, an important distinction. They will actually speak more favorably of political actors further to their right, and similarly, people who are center-left will speak more favorably to actors further to their left than even people at their own position, or actors at their own position. So sending out a coherent message in certain circumstances, like Trump did, can actually be a net benefit in motivating people, getting them involved. But I think the Conservatives have learned quite rightly that their goal here is just to be a viable alternative to an unpopular government.
Kenneth, what's your take on the fact that Brown has sort of gone away from Ford, away from Trump, and very much gone back to the future and taken a chapter out of Bill Davis's playbook?
I think he feels that his base is going to stick with him. The conservative side of the conservative base is going to stick with him no matter what.
Social conservatives, the economic conservatives?
They have no real alternative to Patrick Brown.
Well,
so
stay
he's
home is an
pitching
alternative.
yes, but they're quite unhappy with the current government, so I don't think they're staying home. I just want to mention, I thought the most interesting thing in Frank's data to me was that it demonstrated we're not terribly polarized, and that there was a real difference between the liberal voter and everybody else. Both the conservatives and, to a large extent, the New Democrat and the Green voter are all feeling that their economic prospects are rather bleak. And it's the liberals, the Sunny Way liberals, who are the ones who feel everything's going great, my kids are going to do good, I'm going to do good. And so that is a really unique thing, I think, about the Canadian situation, very different from the American situation.
Let me get some feedback on that. Christine, psychologically speaking, liberals still see sunny ways and everybody else not so much?
Well, that keys in again to the inherent difference that's underlying, like the traits that predict liberalism is, openness and high compassion without conscientiousness means that you don't really have an idea of the ability of the human heart to sin or to act on impulse. And instead you believe in this kind of hyper-rational ability of the human being that we can examine our environment and then we think about what we want to do and then we choose the best way to act. But that's not at all how it ends up happening. So they think, everything is going to be great. Don't need to worry about it. And they're not kind of keeping track of how things are, how much work you need to put in to build the society as it is today.
But that's just empirically based problem solving, right? Isn't it? I mean, that's supposedly what politicians are supposed to do.
But it's amazing how much these kind of innate differences, like the brain, it's built on the old reptilian kind of part of it. And even though we have these like frontal cortices that allow us to think abstractly about things and help us to rationalize, unfortunately, it's still locked into these kinds of systems that control what we pay attention to, how we solve problems, the kinds of things that we find rewarding to engage in.
How different is the populism, Frank, that you are describing today from, say, the populism of Preston Manning's Reform Party introduced to Canadian politics, say, 25 years ago?
I mean, populism is generally thought of as being ideologically thin. You can see expressions of populism on the left, you can see expressions on the right. John Chrétien, some have claimed, was a centrist populist. But I think that the brand of populism that we've seen emerging in the United States, but also which we see in Europe, and in particular in Brexit, is a different, well, maybe it's not different, it's a reincarnation of some forms of this more ordered outlook, which we saw at earlier stages in European history, which produced disturbing results. You actually, the incidence of, so I think the populism we're looking at, and by the way, interestingly enough, the populism in Canada, even though you have, sort of left populist versions of populism in the form of, guys like Bernie Sanders or Corbyn, who are very successful selling those messages, in Canada, populism seems to be very much focused in a conservative area. And
Jack Layton was a populist. Jack Layton was always beating up the banks and the telcos on behalf of the little guy.
But
and I think Stephen Harper showed some of that as well.
No. My point is that it can manifest
on both ends of the spectrum.
On both ends.
But if I was to compare the constituencies who are currently supporting Patrick Brown, who looks like he's going to win a stunning majority at this stage.
Frank, 6 months away. Even
Yeah, you can never predict.
Pollsters don't
yeah, no,
predict.
because I go back and look, and I went, oh, well, Wynne was behind the last time, and
the Liberals were behind 3 elections in a row.
They're not.
Come on, let him go out on a limb here. This is
No,
fun.
I'm not. Well, right now it's pretty hard to imagine that's not going to happen in some form. Yeah. The NDP are stuck below 20. The Liberals are around 24. It's a perfect storm for that center-left vote, and he's riding high.
Your buddy at Forum's got the NDP in second place right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, that's fine. I mean, I haven't updated my provincial data, are a few months old, so I don't know.
Okay.
And actually, I had Wynne coming a little back in the game on approval. But the point is that in Ontario, the Patrick Brown supporters are probably the most populist, in this particular expression of populist, of any we've seen on issues like being relatively much more allergic to trade, particularly strong support for trade, very much economically pessimistic, convinced that the country and the province are going to hell in a handbasket, wary about immigration, not comfortable with a lot of the aspects of the diversity narrative. So, and for example, I think it's great that Patrick Brown is sketching out things like, we're gonna have a carbon tax, and we're going to be, respect gender rights. That's great, but it just isn't where the constituency is, and so I'll be puzzled whether it'll be a triumph of we'd really like to get rid of this other person, and then maybe this person will become the one we hope and think it really is, because I don't see populism in Canada seems to be kind of orphaned politically right now.
Well, funny that you mentioned that, because I once asked, I'm going to make you sit through this one a bit, but I'm going to get back to you because it was one of your competitors that I was speaking to about this. And Christopher, I'll go to you first on it. I once asked a fellow pollster of Frank's, could the Trump phenomenon happen here? And his answer was no. And it couldn't happen here because we just don't have enough angry, white, bitter, quasi-racist men in this country to give, the kind of victory to a potential politician here the way it did for Donald Trump. Do you see that?
So I think it's less likely to happen here than in the United States, and there's all kinds of peculiarities to the American system that allowed it to happen there. That having been said, I mean, I think the association of anger and race is also a reasonable one given the U.S. pattern. But if you look at some of the data that we looked at, for this show, I mean, on issues about are there too many immigrants and too many non-white immigrants coming to the country, it just wasn't the case that you saw a very clear pattern of, as Stephen Harper called them, old stock Canadians saying, yes, there are too many, and newer Canadians saying, no, there are not too many. It was actually surprising at how much agreement there was, whether people were first-generation immigrants, second-generation immigrants, or, quote-unquote, old stock, to use Harper's term, Canadians. There was agreement on, almost agreement. It was a bit of a difference, but not too much. So I don't think the distinction on sort of race and gender lines, I think it's a reasonable one to make, but I wouldn't blow it up and make it too much of it. There is an opportunity to elicit, as Rob Ford showed, to elicit anger, frustration, anti-elitism, i.e. populism, among non-traditional groups in the population. So, nobody thought Donald Trump could happen in the United States either, and he did. I think a reasonable expectation, 15 years ago would have been that a Rob Ford would never emerge in Toronto, and he did. The NDP winning in Alberta, you see all of these unexpected phenomena happen, I think, because elites find creative ways to sort of appeal to things that were maybe unexpected or other people didn't see coming. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of a Trump candidate in Canada.
I wouldn't rule it out either. I mean, you need to become president of the United States, you need like 48%, I think, of the popular vote he got. You can get elected here as prime minister with a majority government, 37% of the popular vote does. So, yeah, absolutely could happen here.
It could happen here. You see a Trump-style. I mean, I guess the point that your competitor was trying to make was that Canada is just a much kinder, gentler nation, more egalitarian, and the circumstances, the conditions for that kind of...
I'm sure our guy would have, his own brand of lunacy. I mean, Trump's very much an American character, but could somebody reach office in Canada who represented a minority, on either the left or the right, represented a Bernie Sanders worldview or a Donald Trump worldview, yeah, absolutely.
Well, not Bernie Sanders. I'm thinking more on the other way, because
It could go either way, is my point in Canada.
Frank, do we have by your polling, do we have enough angry, embittered, underemployed white men in this country who are ticked off about the way things are going and could give us a kind of a national government the way they've got in the States?
Well, again, think about the numbers. You got people who are telling us my kids overwhelmingly are going to do more poorly. I didn't give you the most recent numbers, but the polling I'm just doing, I asked people, are you doing better than last year? 13%.
Are doing better than last year.
Are doing better. So this celebratory kind of Bay Street model that everything's wonderful. Look, both the American and Canadian economies, since this century has begun, are operating at about a 1.5% growth rate when you factor in the recessions. Mm-hmm. Of that tepid growth, much more of it is being appropriated by a narrow cadre at the top. You know, it oscillates from year to year, but overall those patterns are very clear. So you compare that to a period of the 50 years where the last century closed out, where growth was going 3.5%. Think about the compounding of 1.5 versus 3.5, and distributed in a far more egalitarian fashion, which saw this rise of shared prosperity. It's wreaking.
It's a very different society.
Look, we have, and I think maybe the issue is more class than race. And class, obviously, the United States is highly interdependent with race. But in Canada, staid Canadians tell us if present trends with inequality at the top continue, we're going to see violent class conflict. Think about that. And I think this denial, the elite, and what was it, 10 Days That Shook the World, go back and read that for those there's other kind of cautionary notes for people who forget history. I'm not saying we're on the verge of bloody revolution, but I am saying that something is really different right now, and that a lot of people are super unhappy.
Christine.
I was going to say, though, isn't that the case that what they've always said, like throughout history, that this is going to produce violent class conflict, this is going to produce violent class conflict, and that was what initially communism was trying to stir up, and yet time and time again they've never been successful at doing that, and instead they had to switch over to identity politics and different groups of races or gender, and then that was the way how they began the revolutionary movements in places. So I think that because of part of the way how Canada was founded, whereby in the States they had to fight for their identity. So they created this narrative around them where whites were the home race, and then any other person or any other person of color who came in, they were the outsider. Whereas here in Canada, we're all immigrants who came in together. So instead, we've internalized multiculturalism as a value, as opposed to identity being something that's our right that we have to fight for.
So you do not see greater polarization happening in the Canadian Commonwealth today?
No, I don't believe so.
Interesting. Okay. In spite of all the numbers he just showed.
In spite of all that, I think a lot of it has to do with the narrative, and the fact that Andrew Scheer is the one who ended up getting voted in to be the Conservative leader is a demonstration of that.
That's a good point. You know, Andrew Scheer is hardly what you call a radical ideological
No, but that was
right?
more a victory of the party rather than what the voters were thinking. He was trailing way behind Max Bernier, like by a margin of 2.5 times. So thank the dairy farmers and some of the institutional elites in the party. That was not a reflection of public opinion or voter preferences within. I'm not saying it wasn't a good choice. I'm just saying there was a disjuncture. The question, like I think the sort of issue of people, I don't think people always say these things. In fact, one of the advantages, whatever I've lost in mental acuity, I make up by asking the same questions in a semantically consistent fashion through time, which gives you kind of a time. I'm going to run out of road on this one, but so far it's working pretty well. So when you look at the things, for example, that show that the patterns of things like economic optimism, which prevailed for the last half of the 20th century in upper North America, at the beginning of this, and continued right to the beginning of the century, when you ask people, are you going to be better off 5 years from now? Are you going to be worse off or the same? By a margin of close to 3 to 1, people went, I'm going to be better off. And that was what you saw going backwards for 30 years. Those numbers now are completely flipped.
Well, can I ask about Justin Trudeau's victory from a couple of years ago? I mean, that was certainly the strong suggestion at that time was that the country was fed up with, or I guess a big enough chunk of the country was fed up with what Jason Kenney called the wrong tone from the previous Conservative government, and we were looking for sunnier ways. Do you still see that out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think people would obviously prefer an optimistic candidate to a pessimistic one. But if they are angry, I mean, it's a very good point. Anger manifests itself in all kinds of bizarre, unpredictable ways. We might think personalities of the candidates matter. We might think things like their lifestyle or their sort of quote unquote, moral uprightness might matter. I mean, all of these things that we might think matter historically for the viability of a candidate can get thrown out of the window when anger is the motivating factor. And there's a case to be made. I mean, thinking again in the broader historical time frame, there's a case to be made that what we're actually seeing now in the United States and perhaps trickling into Canada is in fact the norm. That was suppressed quite considerably during, first of all, the Cold War, the boom after the Second World War, even you could argue the depression in between. And for example, polarization in Congress is now at levels that look like polarization in Congress used to look like. So it's anomalous in relatively recent time periods, but not grand historically.
So Ken, in our last 30 seconds here, should we journalists spend a lot less time worrying about left versus right and more open versus ordered when we cover politics today?
I think that open versus ordered is a really interesting way to look at the political landscape. I think, though, that I see a lot of fluidity out there, and left and right are useful labels, open, ordered are useful labels. I'm not sure 3 years, 5 years down the line whether we'll still be using them the same way we do now. Voters are complicated, and right now at this moment, I can't remember a time in Canada where things have seemed more open, more fluid, and subject to change.
Political prognostication is such a perilous profession.
Which was why I was so impressed with Frank going out on a limb. And,
there you go.
Qualify that. Prediction's really hard.
Ken, I
about the
thank
future.
the man from Ecos himself. There's Frank Graves and Ken White, whose new book I highly recommend, Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. And on the other side of the table, Christopher Cochran and Christine Brophy, both the pride of the University of Toronto, my alma mater as well. Great to have everybody here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.